Okay, well, welcome, welcome. We got folks joining us. We're going to get started here in a minute once we get a good quorum. While we're at it, if folks want to drop into the chat, let me know where you're coming from. I'm in Portland, Oregon today. Hey, Britt. San Antonio. Hi, Jacques. Milwaukee. Austin, Texas. We're coming to Austin in a few weeks. Looking forward to seeing folks there. Hi, Jen in Seattle, just up the road, just west of Weird. Oh, there's a lot of places with that now. Let's see. Montreal, Northern Lower Michigan. Julie, I'm from Traverse City. So it's probably not melting up there yet, but you never know. Hi, Jody from London. Wow, what a great crowd. Super fun to see everybody. The sunrise side, exactly. All right, how are we looking? I think we're pretty good. Should we kick off, Julie?
Yes, go right ahead.
All right. Well, welcome, folks. Glad to have you here. I suspect a number of you actually attended last week's. There's some familiar names here, but for those of you that didn't take part in the first in our webinar series, let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Aric Wood, the Chief Strategy Officer at Tigerhall and the author of the Strategy Activation Playbook. A lot of the content we're going to talk about today is really rooted in some of the content of this book, which was really designed after watching major transformations that both succeeded and failed in my 20-year career, leading change activation at the helm of Explain, where we worked pretty much with Fortune 500 companies around the world on global change initiatives. I was also worked on change programs inside as a senior leader at Intuit prior to that, as well as other tech companies in Silicon Valley, trying to stand up new product approaches, new processes. So I've got a good sense of what it's like to actually try to work inside of an organization as well. And it's hard, I know. So I've got a lot of empathy for whatever one of you do. We are going to today dive into the first in the four sections on the process and principles of strategy activation from a human-centered approach. So last week we covered the fundamentals of change activation. For those of you that attended last week, it was a lot of lecture, it was a lot of content. It was really meant to be the primer for the whole thing. I want to make the next couple conversations a little bit more discussion oriented. So we'll leave a little bit more time today for discussion at the end. So if you've got questions, please, please, if you've got them in the process, go ahead and throw them in the chat. But then when we get to the end, we're going to actually open up the mics and have some open discussion in forums. So anxious to do that with everyone. In the envision phase today, we're going to be focusing on the first stage of setting up a strategy activation program, and specifically focusing on how do we develop line of sight for employees. So one of the most critical mistakes people make right out of the gates is building a one-size-fits-all campaign. And what we really need to understand is how do we develop clarity for every person in the organization to understand where I'm situated in this major change, where we're going, and what role do I play. So building that line of sight is goal number one. Number two, we want to talk about how to lead with vision and equip our leaders to share a common story of the future. Also, a critical, necessary first step that we need to make sure that we're enforcing even as we're designing our change programs. And then lastly, we want to understand from the very start, how do we create clarity and build momentum with a measurement system? And then, like we did last week, we'll share some of the go-to tools and exercises for this phase. And for those of you that have attended, we'll send those out to you. So hopefully you can start working with them right away with your own teams. So let's situate ourselves first with a quick poll. We all have seen transformations and initiative launched in our companies. I'm just curious to kind of get a sense in the room of how employees in your organization typically first learn about a new initiative in your company. So we'll have a poll up here for a second. Pick the one that resonates most. What do you most commonly see in your organization? And then we'll unpack this a little bit.
We're almost there in terms of results.
All right.
Just giving people one last second. And all right, I will end the poll.
What do we got? Company-wide emails, the big winner, 44%. I was hoping that wasn't going to be the answer, but it is, and it's still the answer for most organizations. So not a terrible surprise there. That is followed by town hall meeting, 26%, and then roughly in the same order, presentation, small team meetings, or directly from their manager. Unfortunately, directly from the manager is only 7%. So this is actually pretty consistent with the research, which doesn't surprise me. We're all at the front edge of transformation in organizations. So let me close this and we'll talk a little bit about what this means for us and why, in fact, the results of this poll are setting up what it is that we're going to be talking about next. So we're going to look at some research first. So if we look at the organizations that have actually been in that 30% that were successful, and we actually look at their practices, we see a really interesting trend here, which is that organizations with successful transformations are more likely than others to use face-to-face communications, and especially leader-led communications, to support the momentum of their transformation. And for those organizations in the almost half that said, no, we lead with email, this was the interesting thing that grabbed me on this chart is it was the one example of a communication method that was frequently used that in fact was less used by the successful organizations and most used by the unsuccessful organizations. So takeaway here is humans learn from humans. We need to make our leaders storytellers. We need to get the folks in the organization telling a consistent story, sharing it broadly, and sharing it repeatedly, and importantly, sharing it consistently. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we set up our activation in this phase of work, which we call the envision phase, to be able to equip our organization to do this well and flip the script on this email-led transformation, which we see clearly is not effective. In fact, it's probably detrimental. So first, busting the most important myth of change activation. We continue to, for whatever reason, believe that we can take a strategy and move directly to execution. And this is the myth that I think we all have to take part in sort of breaking this myth in our organizations because we were taught this maybe in business school, maybe over history that, we can take something that's new and cascade it in the organization and people are going to just go do it. But that isn't the reality in our current world. In fact, what the reality looks like is more like this. If we take the strategy and we try to execute it right away, it will become a failed execution because we haven't anticipated this thing that I like to call the activation abyss. And the activation abyss is what happens when strategy hits the organization in an email and says, this is what we're going to go do it. We have ignored the fact that we need to do some storytelling to prepare people for what the strategy is and why we're doing it. We have not engaged folks in conversations around the strategy, haven't engaged them in the conversations around the vision, haven't perhaps engaged them in the solutioning, most likely. And we've sort of failed to meet them where they're at. And we need to understand that our organization is not a structure. Our organization is an organism of people. So we need to understand how to, from a human-centered perspective, get people across this activation abyss before they're going to start taking part in execution. So the revolutionary idea for today's session is it shouldn't be revolutionary, but it is. We need to go back a few steps, right? So at that moment where we as transformation leaders have been tasked with standing up a new initiative, a new transformation, we have to stop and we have to use the discipline to say, okay, we need to go back a few steps before we actually start building a plan to execute this. Let's talk about where we're going. Let's talk about the storytelling. Let's talk about the journey we're taking. The leaders, and this is understandable, the leaders already knew, I want to go to that place. I am making a plan to get from here to there. And they've gone out and they've hired Bain or McKinsey or BCG or some other firm to build a strategy or co-create a strategy internally with their team. And then they come with the strategy to the town hall meeting and say, here's what we're doing, right? But what we've forgotten is that no one else has been privy to this conversation. The people in the organization don't see the same thing we see. They don't see that destination in the future. They don't understand why we're going to this new place. They're lacking all of this context. So we really need to take a couple steps back as transformation leaders and say, all right, before we start trying to activate this strategy, how do we actually build out the clarity for folks in terms of where are we going? Why are we going there? How is this going to be better for us? And what role we're going to play in that process? Then and only then can those folks sort of be equipped and ready to accept the rest of the messaging that we want to share. And this goes back to something we talked about last week. So if we think about this from a human-centered perspective, we think about it from the perspective of the activation curve. What we're looking at here is a progress that people learn in. So in a hear it phase, employees are first going to become aware of the new initiative. They're going to start to understand it. Hopefully, they're going to get to the point because we've done a good job in our communications of accepting that, okay, I get what's in it for me and I get why this is better for the organization. I'm willing to try. They're not yet bought in. They're just saying, I'm willing to try. That's the point at which we can start to introduce learning and development. They can start to acquire new skills. They can start applying them in their work and they can start to internalize those things. And so this is the place where we're starting to introduce those kinds of activation activities, right? So we're building on communications, we're layering in now some learning and development and skill building and capability building. And then, and only then, have they started to internalize and say, oh yeah, this is actually better than the way we used to do it. And now we're going to start to integrate it and move it into that live it phase, where it's now becoming kind of our business as usual. So if we think about this from the perspective of that moment at the town hall, right? The leaders have come in, they've got their strategy, they're ready to announce the strategy at the town hall meeting. Where do folks think, just type it into the chat, where do folks think leaders are on this curve the day of that town hall meeting where they're announcing the new strategy? Believe it, live it, believe it, live it, believe it, between believe it and live it. Yep. So I think, yeah, you're spot on, right? Leaders at this point are probably right in that line between believe it and live it. They're fully aware, they're fully bought in. They've actually been kind of internalizing this through the entire process of strategy making. So they're at a place right now where they're ready to launch and integrate. And this is why we get all that pressure to say, okay, change team, now go make it so, right? Go stand it up because they're already there, right? Now, where do we think employees are at this point? They're at the town hall meeting. They know there's a big announcement. Maybe the email hasn't come out yet. Where are those folks? Not on the board. Maybe at Hear It. Uh, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, if we start looking at where folks are and we're mapping them at this point, maybe a couple people have been read in, but for the most part, the organization is here, right? We are not yet fully aware of what we're doing, where we're going, why, and how. So they are still just entering into the hear it phase. And what this does, I think, is this illustrates graphically that activation abyss. This is how almost every transformation project begins. And this is what we're going to try today to talk about how to introduce an antidote to kind of fix this problem is if we believe that the leaders are already at this live it phase, and if we know that employees are already down here at the hear it phase, why in that town hall meeting are we rolling out the strategy? They don't have any context. There's no understanding or situation or sense making of what are we doing, why, and how we're going to get there. And unfortunately, I'd like to say that most leaders actually step back and do that work, but my observation is that most don't, right? And it's very natural. As humans, we've sort of been on this journey the entire time. I've thought of a number of examples where we've, in my work with large organizations, had to actually sit down with the leadership team and say, all right, let's sit back and talk about the vision first. And can you articulate that? And the teams largely couldn't articulate a consistent vision. And so you can understand why this is going to be a problem when that information hits the email or hits the town hall meeting and people are feeling sort of disassociated from what's going on. So what we want to do to create that harmony and to create that association is to focus in this phase at creating that line of sight. We want to connect every role to the goal. And we want everybody in that audience to understand that this is the destination that we're all trying to get to collectively. This is the strategy that's going to get us collectively there. But within that strategy, there's segments of it. My team might only be part of this segment, and my role is going to be this contribution to get to this place. We need to build that line of sight at the very beginning. So we can't be ready yet for capability building, culture activation, training, communications, if we actually haven't connected those dots at the very start. And so what we're going to talk about today is how do we do that work up front, maybe even while we're planning our activation plan, so that we can get the ground ready for what's to come in the activation phase. We need to make sure we're building that line of sight with folks. And we're going to do that by thinking thoughtfully around what I like to call an employee navigation system. So the way that people develop line of sight is they're looking for these things to all be somewhat aligned and harmonious. I need to, in my own head, have a common story where I can see, all right, our organization has a clear purpose and mission. I can read it on the website. I saw it in my onboarding. We're living this. We have an operating system that we call values. Sometimes those values are on the wall. Sometimes those values are lived. Hopefully they're both. Hopefully that they're also consistent and people say, okay, those things are linked. I see the values are linked to the purpose of the mission. And then when you present a vision, that vision has to also be consistent with the purpose and the values for people to even believe it, right? So if we present a vision that's not in alignment with those things, we're going to have difficulty. So as change leaders, we want to make sure that these things are in place. Okay, now the vision story we're telling is a consistent one that actually is aligned with our purpose, our mission, and our values. Then and only then, once that vision is clear and we've painted that picture of the destination, the flag on the top of the summit, can we then start to break down the detail? So we don't want to start with the detail. We want to prepare folks to understand the detail by situating these first three things. And then in the strategy, we can start to say, all right, now if we all agree that this destination is where we want to go and why it's a better place to be, let's look now at our proposed approach and route to get there. And better yet, below the strategy level, we're going to break that down into a roadmap. That route's going to be in segments. And not everybody's going to take the entire journey with us. This team might actually just be focusing on segment one, and that team might be focusing on segment two. And that's critical because collectively we're going to get to the summit, but each of us has a different role to play. Each group, each stakeholder team has a different role to play. And then even within those teams, at the level of the role map, I as an individual probably have a unique role to play. So we need to start to be able to set this story at the very beginning before we're actually doing any of our change activation story, telling, our capability building, et cetera. Importantly, one thing I want to leave you with here is that the top part of this, right, the purpose, the values, the vision, and to some degree the strategy, these can be standardized. So that one size fits all approach does work here, right? We should have a common set of values. The values shouldn't feel different from one department to another. We should have a common vision so that everyone knows that this is, our goal is to put a man on the moon. We should have a strategy that we all understand so we can situate where our part of it is in it. But at this point, we as change leaders need to be thinking about this. Everything below that line, from strategy down, has to be personalized. We have to now break the tradition of one size fits all communication, and we need to start building line of sight for folks by having them see, I understand now that in that strategy, this part of the roadmap is the part that we own, and my role in that segment is clear to me. And if we can get that level of personalization down into the organization to the very last mile of all of our employees, we'll now have a situation where every individual can see how they roll up to the bigger goal. And I used a reference in my book to a common story that illustrates this, but this idea of putting a man on the moon. There's a funny story of a visit in 1961 to NASA's headquarters in Houston when President Kennedy walked in and ran into a custodian and said, "What do you do here?" And without missing a beat, the person looked the president and I said, "I'm here to put a man on the moon." Right. And it's an extreme and wonderful story, but it illustrates this point, which is if everybody in your organization can that quickly understand my role is part of this overall segment of this strategy to get to this destination, you now have the level of alignment that you need to create a movement and create the momentum to move towards activation. So there's Lots of different paths that need to be explained, but we need to also make sure that that one destination is clear. So with that, we're going to kick into the how stuff next. I want to just realign us around kind of the core concept of strategy activation, which is putting people at the center. So I like to think of it as the art and science of persuading people to align around, engage with, and adopt new ways of working in order to achieve a shared vision. And that shared vision part is the really critical anchor. We need to have everybody seeing that destination and then understanding what role do I have to play in this? And if we can get that, we're much more likely to have people join the momentum of the movement and move forward together to bring it to life. So let's dig in a little bit to the actual how of this. So we talked last week about the fundamentals of activation, and we talked about the four phases. So today, what we want to do is focus on the first phase, envision. But just as a refresher, and for those folks that weren't on the call last week, what I propose is that there's four things that we need to do before we get to execute. We need to first build a very clear vision of the future so that we can situate and establish that line of sight for folks. Secondly, we need to use our user-centered design techniques to go do research in the organization and uncover the barriers to change, uncover the forces for and against our transformation, understand the unique wants and needs of different stakeholder groups so that we can personalize those journeys, personalize those stories, personalize those learning journeys for each of the key stakeholder groups that we need to get on board. And if we understand those things and those unique wants and needs, and we understand where those barriers and obstacles are, then and only then can we go into that design phase with the information we need to know which building blocks to put into an activation plan for each of those core stakeholder groups. Then with that, we then go into the execute phase. And the execute phase, we'll talk about that in the execute session. But even within the execute phase, we're going to tweak it a bit to make it much more of a principle-based, design-based approach so that once we launch our activation plan, we can constantly measure and analyze what's working and make course corrections. So it's an iterative design process because we might get it 80% right, but we're still going to get 20% of it wrong. And what we need to do is be positioned to make course corrections quickly so we don't lose momentum and we can keep things on track. So this is the picture of the next 4 weeks. Today, what we're going to focus on is envision. And this phase is, in some ways, the shortest and the simplest phase. So good news is we'll have some time for Q&A today and discussion. The bad news is that this is also the phase that is most typically overlooked. So as evidence, we can just go right back to that illustration of walking into the town hall with that 100-page PowerPoint deck from the strategy firm. This is still happening every day today. And what we need to do is make sure that we take those steps back and we persuade our leaders that they need to take the steps back with us to go back to this envisioning phase so that we can create a clear and consistent vision story that we can transfer human to human into our organization to prepare them for the activation that's to come and to prepare them to join the journey we want them on. So in this phase, there's actually really only two moves that we're making. The first one is we're getting folks aligned around a consistent vision story. And then secondly, we're getting the team committed to a measurement system that's going to help us understand where we're going, how far we are, where we're at in the journey. And by doing so, not only measure our progress, but also build momentum. So this is also in service to building that movement that we want to build inside the organization. So most important tool of the day, and I might argue in my experience that if I only had one exercise to do with senior leaders, this would be the one I do. So note it. I think this is a pretty powerful exercise. The vision mapping exercise is really, the goal is to do this. The goal is to sort of create that common story. And let me back up before I unpack how we do this to share kind of what the current state of the world is. In numerous strategy activation engagements where I and my team were brought in to maybe on the heels of a consulting firm that had just finished the strategy for the corporation, say, okay, can you guys design an activation plan for this? When I sat down with the senior leaders and said, all right, I put a piece of paper in front of them and said, draw me a picture of the vision and then I'd like you to hold it up and tell me the story of the vision. It ended up looking a lot like that parable of the five blind men and the elephant, right? Every person had their own version of it. So the finance person said, yes, we're doing X, Y, and Z so that we can reduce costs and increase efficiency. The marketing person said, yes, we're doing X, Y, and Z so that we can actually have a better customer experience and drive up our NPS score. And then maybe the engineering team said, yes, we're introducing these new initiatives so that we can actually be more efficient in our operations and reduce our tech stack, and so on, right? So from the very start there, I'm sitting with five, six, seven, eight executives who are telling five, six, seven, eight different stories. And this is part of the problem, right? Because if those folks then just went out and they did the town hall meeting and they launched the strategy, to most employees, it would feel like a strategy to nowhere because they're not getting a consistent story of the destination. They're not getting a consistent story of where we're going or why. And so they don't have that anchor to put the rest of that navigation system in line. For their department, they might be hearing a story from their leader that situates what it means to that team, but we still don't have that company-wide alignment that we're here to put a man on the moon. So what we need to do is step back. And this is the hardest part because, of course, we are asking executives for their time, but we also need to come in with the evidence that, hey, if you want to be part of the 30% of organizations that are successful, we got to do this work, right? We know that leader-led change is the only examples that are usually successful. And what we want to do is get everyone around a common story. And so the way that this exercise works, it's very simple. We ask the leader team to sit down and identify in the current state on the left side, what are the 3 or 4 or 5 key descriptors of our current state? What's going on today that describes the situation we're trying to move from? And then over on the right-hand side, let's talk about the future state. So what are the 5 or 6 things that will define what this looks like in 5 years, in 10 years? If we close our eyes and wake up in some time frame, what does our organization look like in the future? And why is it better than the current state? So we want to get them thinking about those things. And then once they've done that part of the exercise, we want them to go to the center, which we call the bridge, and say, all right, now to get from point A to point B, what are the 4 or 5 most critical things we need to do to get there? Maybe it's 2 or 3 critical things we need to do to get there. But what's the story that tells us, here's where we're at in point A, here's where we're at in point B, and here's how we're going to get there? This is so hard for executives to do because they're like, we can't simplify it that much, right? But the key thing as change leaders is we have to force them into this box. This is one of the rare cases where we're going to try to think in the box, because if we don't make it this simple, we won't be able to simply explain it to folks so that they have enough interest and knowledge to want to learn more. So what we typically do is we do this as an individual exercise, and then we bring folks together. We have them share out. We gather the common themes, and we work with the leadership team at the very start of a capability of a change activation program to co-create a common version of this picture. And that common version then becomes the source code for a couple things. It becomes the source code for the stories that we're going to tell. It becomes a source code for maybe a vision map that's going to go on the wall. It becomes a source code for key messaging that we can distribute to our teams to start building communications. It becomes a tool that we can use to start to get the ground ready, to get people ready for what they need to learn in the transformation phases that are coming. And importantly, if we do this right, we now have something that we can share in many ways. So back to that concept of tell folks things 10 times, 10 ways. That simple vision map exercise can equip us with things like posters in the break room, a short podcast that people can hear before the town hall meeting to get them ready for the session, maybe a video from their team leader telling them the story, maybe some one-pagers that those folks that prefer to read their content can look at. I've seen some great examples of people put up whole installations. They walk into the entry lobby of the building, and there's an entire installation there about our vision, our strategy, and our roadmap to get there. Importantly, we also want to equip leaders at all levels with some leader scripts, right? It doesn't need to be, and shouldn't be, a 100-page PowerPoint deck. It should probably be something that looks more like a one-pager with key talking points to make sure that as employees are talking to their managers, they're also hearing that consistent story. So this is really the first phase before we even get into planning, is getting this stuff right so that we can get the organization ready for the activation plan. The second thing that we want to do in this phase is know how to measure the progress. So this is going beyond like just the KPIs. What we want to understand with those leaders, once we've got that vision done, is to ask the simple question, how will we know when we've gotten there? So if we achieve that future state, if we open our eyes in 5 years, what's going to have changed? Describe it to me, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So, what are the different ways of working? What are the different behaviors? How has our culture shifted on one hand? On the other hand, yeah, tell me about the KPIs. Tell me about the cost savings. Tell me about the productivity gains. Tell me about those things as well. We need to understand both of those things for a very simple reason. Organizations that focus exclusively on the KPI at that town hall meeting are going to miss the boat because those KPIs may not actually get hit for 12 to 18 months. And that's going to be demotivating to folks because they won't see progress. If we go back to the activation curve and we start to thinking about it in terms of how would we measure that, we can see what I mean. So in that hear it phase, we're not going to see those net promoter score increases. What we're going to see is evidence of awareness. We're going to see that there's people that can actually recall the vision and the strategy and maybe hit the top 3 points of why we're doing it. Maybe we're getting people that are starting to be able to put the story in their own words. Maybe we're getting people that can say, what do you do here? I'm here to put a man on the moon, right? That's what we're looking for here is the evidence that folks are moving through the hear it phase and they're aware, understanding, and beginning to accept the what and the why and what it means for me. In the second phase, then, in the believe it phase, we're going to start looking for things that are more evidence of agreement. So now we're going to start to see behavior shifts. We're going to see people adopting new ways of working. We're going to maybe see people using that new tech module. We're going to start to see people applying these new things in their daily work. Maybe we're starting to see things like employee satisfaction scores shift. We're starting to get into some quantitative data here where we're starting to see things showing up in some of our pulse surveys. But here we're looking for evidence of agreement. And then and only then do we get to those KPIs that we're all solving for. We're only going to see these leading indicators before we get to the place where we start to see the percentage of people exhibiting new behaviors, starting to see the customer net promoter score increasing, starting to see employee satisfaction increasing, starting to see those cost savings or that sales growth. And what we want to do as storytellers is ensure that when we build that measurement system, that we're measuring all those things. Because in those first phases, what we want our leaders to be doing is reporting out on our progress through the awareness phase. How many of our leaders are aware of and aligned with our strategy and can tell the story in their own words? How many of our folks are starting to exhibit the new behaviors? And if those leaders are equipped with those measurements, they can start to share that information at every town hall meeting, at every all hands meeting, at every team meeting to start to demonstrate that we're moving in the right direction, that we're seeing the green shoots turn into flowers. And ultimately, what that will do is contribute to building momentum. People that are maybe on the fence are going to start getting on board. And so we're starting to work to get the organization moving up in the right direction. And there's lots of ways to measure this. We can look at things like feedback loops, we can do pulse surveys, we can gather sentiment. How many people in the room did this resonate for? How many didn't? Tell me why, right? Most importantly, we want to start to get conversations going and get two-way feedback loops going and use the combination of hard data that we can gather with the soft data that tells us so much. Because as leaders, again, to that idea of course correction, the more we know about what's hitting and what's not hitting, the more we can say, all right, we need to focus more over here and less over there. They're getting that. This is where people are confused. Let's dig into that a little bit more. So these are the two core goals in this phase. If we can build this simple framework in the envision phase, right at the front with leaders, we can now tell a common story and show a common picture of where we're going. We can now break it down into segments so that we can have team conversations to say, your team takes part in this segment and you're so critical to us getting to the summit. And at the role level, individuals can understand what part that they play in it. We'll also have the measurement system to help us build momentum. So we'll know what's working, what's not. It'll help us to course correct the system. It'll also help us to convince people that we're moving in the right direction and hopefully persuade them to sort of join the journey. So, to kind of bring this together, this phase is really about showing and telling the story. And the reason we put this at the front is that we want leaders to start doing this work before we, as transformation leaders, have even maybe completed our activation plan. We need to start laying the groundwork early on to tell that common story. We want to show it with simple visuals and frameworks. So I like to say, like, is it so clear you can put it on the wall? Because if it's not, we're probably not there yet. So, I'm a big fan of information graphics. I'm a big fan of maps. I'm a big fan of giving leaders tools that they can actually present against because that gives them a visual script. We want to tell the story with bite-sized communications. So people can't bite off that 100-page PowerPoint deck. They need to actually hear a 3-minute podcast first of where we're going and why, so that they can start to formulate in their idea of the destination and what's in it for me before they're then ready to hear that strategy. So what are all the bite-sized communications that we can put together? How can we create maybe a series of small leader videos? How can we create some simple briefings? How can we equip people with bite-sized elevator pitches that get them hungry enough to get off the elevator and ask you to tell me more? And then, really importantly, in this phase, we want to discuss and create two-way feedback loops. So, how do we get our leaders to start to have discussions in their team around these things? How do we have them come in with, here's what we're thinking about doing, now tell me your thoughts, and start to engage people in conversations that are going to help people feel heard, help those good ideas get surfaced, and probably make things better as a result. Those discussions and equipping our leaders to have those discussions are one of the most critical factors, according to research, in actually getting an organization to move forward together. I'm going to close with a couple of examples of kind of what this looks like in the wild. And then after some key takeaways, we're going to open it up for some Q&A and discussion. Um, Going back to the core concept, which is we need to create a storytelling journey to get people ready. So when we're launching any initiative, we want to be thinking about, okay, what's the sequence of early communications that we can do to help people get those bite-sized story bits that start to frame that whole picture. So maybe we lead with a video, a short video from a leader or from your departmental leader or someone else that's sort of a peer that's respected in the organization. Maybe we follow it up with a podcast or a white pager, a one pager kind of briefing. Maybe we do some leader-led meetings where we equip each of our middle managers with a script to say, here's a 30-minute meeting, go have this conversation with your teams. We also probably want to start to, in the physical environment, build some of these communications out. So a best practice that I've seen in a number of places is where the client actually creates the vision map and puts it on the wall for all employees to come in and see. So as people are walking through the hallways, they can stop, they can pause, they can talk about this is the future, this is where we're at, this is what we're going to drive. And they can start to situate what role do I play in this bigger picture. Maybe we can create some team meetings in a box where we can equip leaders who maybe aren't comfortable telling the story with here are 3 dance steps. Do this, do this, do this. Here's your 20-minute meeting. Go have a conversation with your team about it and send us the feedback you're hearing, right? By getting folks to practice this, we start to expand the number of people that are involved in the change movement and in the process get some two-way feedback loops. Best practice, and I've only pulled this off a couple of times, but I've seen a number of really successful organizations go out with a rough draft of the vision and the strategy and say, here's what we're thinking. Now let's get teams of 30 people together and give them a red pen and say, what resonates in this vision? What doesn't resonate? How might we make it better? And by engaging employees, even at the stage of strategy making, we can tap into the collective knowledge of an organization and actually make those plans better. And in the process, we have actually got their fingerprints on the plan. So now instead of that thing being thrown over the wall at them, they've now got their fingerprints on this blueprint that then becomes the plan and they feel a sense of ownership for it. So a couple of ideas that you could put to work in your own organizations at this stage, but these are all ways to really build a much higher degree of engagement and a much higher degree of sort of leader-led transformation. So the key takeaways for today in the envision phase: go back to go forward. We need to actually do the work and persuade leaders that we've got to go back a few steps and actually co-create that vision and that story for everyone to understand before we start to get into the activation play. The second thing we need to do is make sure that we're clear about those measurements, including those early indicator measurements, the ones that are going to help us build momentum so that we can see progress and we can build excitement and momentum as we go through the process. And then third, and I think most importantly, a build on both of these things, we really need to focus on the C-suite and the leadership teams to be able to have them equipped to tell a common story. We need to have them all playing off the same script because employees are looking for consistency and harmony. And if we can tell that consistent story, we can equip them to successfully see the destination and situate their own roles and their own team's roles in that process. So we want folks to speak with one voice, and that's really the most important part of this envision phase, is setting the rest of the strategy activation work up for success at this early part of the game. So with that, let's see if we can open up the mics and we can actually have some conversation. I'd love to invite folks to raise their hand if they have a comment or a question, and then Julie will shout folks out, and we can just try to have a little bit of a discussion in our last minutes here today.
So Madhuri, if you take yourself off of mute, you should be able to talk now.
Hi, this was fantastic, Aric. Can you all hear me?
Yes, thanks, Badure.
Okay, great. So my question is this, again, back to experience, right? One thing, hard lesson that I've learned over the years is that alignment is by far the most trickiest and most slippery of the elements in a change journey. And alignment is something that you got to get your fingers on, monitor, track consistently because your stakeholders have agency, right? You have people going in and out of the organization. You have leaders who might be in role, out of the role. So keeping everybody aligned is by far the trickiest. And I was wondering, in your experience, have you ever figured out how to measure, right? So as you're tracking things, how do you keep track of alignment?
I love that question. That was the holy grail for a long time before we had technologies to help us do this to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But at its core, what we want to be able to do is this. The illustration that I have in my head as you were talking was of the activation curve and that idea that leaders are here and employees are here. Well, what ends up happening as you go through these programs is that that fragments out into individual stakeholder groups. Maybe the customer success team is here, maybe the account executives are here, maybe the engineers are here. And to your point of alignment, we not only need to make sure that those teams are aligned, but that we're trying to move those groups up the curve to get to the same place eventually at the same time. And so alignment is so important because if we know that groups aren't aligned, that also tells us as change leaders where we need to invest more. You know, where do we go fast? Where do we go slower? Oh, wow, this group's moving up the curve really quickly. Maybe we don't need to invest as much there as we thought. This group is really lagging and they're not getting it. Okay, great. Let's shift some resources over here and really do some workshops with these folks, do some more active interventions with these folks to try to help them catch up on the activation curve. And the way that the most common way to measure this is through sort of sentiment surveys, pulse surveys, um, um, sort of those broad spectrum issues. But the challenge with that is those tend to be not real time, right? They tend to be maybe every
Right.
60, 90 days. So this is another reason why, if we can find technologies that we can use that are already in our stack, where we can start to gather things like sentiment, where maybe we launch a podcast or launch a something through Teams, and then understand how many people took this up, how many people watched it all the way through. Did people comment on it? Was it plus or minus? Like we can start to gather those kinds of things because we have technologies in our systems that can maybe reveal some of those kinds of data points. it's another area where we want to really try as much as possible to get those two-way leader feedback
Right.
sessions going. So another example, we did a program with UPS, which is a public case study that I can share, where we actually created those sort of meetings in a box for leaders at this early stage, sent them out. Each leader basically opened up the box, kind of like an IKEA thing. Here's step one, here's step two, here's step three, and facilitated a conversation among their teams. But then we're required to actually fill out a survey of what were the key themes you heard? What were people in support of? What were people resistant to? And then shared that back to the change team. And then that kind of data became the kind of data that we could check alignment, because we could look at it team by team and say these 6 teams are getting it, these 3 aren't, and get down to that granular level. So the reality is it takes a lot of creativity. But I think if you look into your organization, you're going to find things that you can ride along on. So if there's already pulse surveys, if there's already employee surveys, add your 3 questions to those things right out of the gates at this stage to get
Right.
those measurements. And then in the design phase, when we get into that phase, one of the things we're going to talk about is how to build in building blocks that are actually feedback loops so that you've got more visibility than other people do in terms of your change initiative, so you can do this.
Thank you. I love the idea of asking for an action from the leaders and then circling back for feedback. I think that to me sounds like a very doable way to approach this and get consistent feedback and see their alignment. Thank you. Thank you so
Absolutely. Thank you for
much.
the question.
I think we have 2 questions in the chat, Eric, if you want
Uh-huh.
to answer. We have one from Deb and one from Kelly.
Sure. So Deb says, can you share how to course correct if a transformation is in planning or design, but the vision isn't clearly understood, leadership isn't aligned? Are there nuances to the steps you shared? I think what I'll share is a story, Deb. So my answer is stop the presses and go back to square one. Because what I've observed is that the organizations that just say, we got to go on, just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, there's a business case against doing that we need to be able to tell as change leaders to say, if you want to throw all this money away, let's keep executing without having clarity around the vision. And if we do that, we're going to be part of that 70% that fails. And so there's a lot of data out there, and we're going to talk specifically in the business case session, which is the 6th in the series. We're going to talk about some of this data that you can use to build these business cases. But I've had to have real hard conversations with leaders to just say, look, you're paying me for my counsel. What we can tell you is you'll be guaranteed to fail if you just keep pressing forward. But if we take 1 week just to solve this and get leadership aligned around this vision and the strategy, we're going to have a 2.5 times better chance of being successful. We need to have those data-driven conversations with leaders to really get them to take this information in. And unfortunately, obviously a lot of particularly finance-driven leadership teams want hard data and hard metrics, and the soft persuasion that I might offer isn't going to be convincing. So the nuance I would recommend is like, let's look for the business case. Let's go in there with hard data and say, this is what we know about transformation, what works and what doesn't work. And here's how we'll improve our odds of success if you give me this 4-hour meeting with the leadership team. That's one of the key takeaways that I've had. Kelly asks, and I guess this will be our last question. How have you balanced secrecy in keeping sales teams focused on closing the year with new year strategic changes? And how have you found success in winning hearts and minds with doing what you shared in a very condensed timeline? Actually, Kelly, would you mind coming off the mic and just sharing a little bit more about the context for that question?
Here, I've just given Kelly permission to speak.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess where I'm coming from on that is when you're thinking about end of year changes going into the next year,
Mhm.
what I've experienced is when it's a sizable change, there's a lot of tension in sales leaders' minds of, hey, I don't want to distract my teams. We're trying to close this year strong. I
Yeah.
can't distract my teams. I can't get in front of them. Like I don't want them to lose focus on what we need to do to close the year or the quarter. And so I guess I'm just thinking about it as, maybe it's expectation setting, but oftentimes I feel like, it's just the timelines feel very condensed and shortened in how much work needs to happen at a larger global organization to get to the layers that are mentioned for, understanding alignment, being able to tell that story. And a critical part here is before things leak and the
Mhm.
story, has its own legs.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love that question. I actually, I had an experience. I'm gonna offer sort of just two things to think about based on one case study, which was a pharmaceutical company that I worked with that had this challenge. We're trying to make a major shift in our ways of working. In their case, it was shifting towards a more consultative selling process across the entire organization. But they were trying to do it while still trying to hit their right before them goals of this quarter, this month, this week.
Mhm.
And so what we ended up having to do in this case, and it's one approach, I'm sure other people have other ideas, was really work with leadership to say, look, we have to think of this as a system problem. One of the challenges we're having is that people's incentive plans are working against this change, right? So we've given these folks disincentives by putting such a focus on this quarter's results for them to actually invest in the long-term investment you want to make in them so that they can actually be significantly more successful in the next 4 quarters. So we had to do two things with that group. We had to, number one, elongate the time frame to help tell a story that shared how the investment in this quarter was going to actually help them 2x or 3x their performance 1 year from now. And
Mhm.
then we actually had to go back into the organization and say, and we need some relief on the incentives to align their incentives to join that 3 or 4 quarter journey so that some of the pressure is off in this quarter. And we're going to pay them, in effect, to invest this quarter so that we could get those outsized returns at the end of that transformation in quarters 3, 4, and 5.
Mhm.
So I think at large, what I guess I'm going to close with on this one is that all transformation is a system design problem. And
Mhm.
what we need to be thinking about always as change leaders is what are we changing here and how is that impacting other areas of the business? And what are those things do we need to get aligned, whether it's systems, whether it's processes, whether it's incentive plans, et cetera, et cetera. Because in effect, what you've described is a barrier to change. And it's actually teeing us up for next week. This is what we're going to look for next week, is finding those barriers to change so we can mitigate them before they basically sabotage our transformation.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Well, thank you so much. I think some of these things, and Kelly's last comment about it being a tough sell in a tough market, I think this is the last reason I'll highlight why it's so critical to get this leadership conversation going at the very start, right? We actually have to have the will to make these changes. And sometimes the only people that can actually support us in recognizing that sometimes we need to shift things like incentive plans, sometimes we need to make sacrifices in near-term results to achieve long-term results, are the leaders who are authorized to make those decisions. So this really puts a lot of pressure on the envision phase being the one where before we even started our activation program, we're basically building our change ambassador team among leaders first, because the reality is we are going to need their support. We are going to need them to make some hard decisions that are maybe above our own pay grade. And if we can convince them that this is the investment that's going to give them the highest return, we'll be more successful as change leaders. If we don't, we're going to have the problems of feeling like we're being told to do something, but we haven't really funded that charter. We don't really have the authority to make those changes and make those things happen. So biggest takeaway, let's start working in phase one with leaders. Let's get that story straight. Let's make sure that we have everyone telling a consistent story. And then let's engage leaders in the process of measuring and monitoring that transformation so we can keep it on track. Thanks all. We hope to see you next week. We will be talking about uncovering barriers to change. So we'll be diving deep into how do we discover what's going on in our organization? How do we actually get in front of those things in our change and activation planning? And I look forward to having the conversation with you next week. If you got any questions, please reach out to me. And you can reach me at my address at Tigerhall or via LinkedIn. Always happy to have conversations about what's going on in your world. Thanks all.